machine and a Windows machine available in the Azure cloud. So the next thing I want to do is set up a Velociraptor server and client. So I just updated this stuff. I was using an older version of Velociraptor, and the latest version is pretty good. So we can use that. So I do a CD to go home, and I make a directory of Velociraptor and go into that directory for no particular reason, just so I have a tidy place to put this stuff. Now I use wget to get a recent version of Velociraptor, version 7. They said we should update to a version after this, but it didn't seem to be available on the website, so this version is fairly up to date, 7.02. Now we take the file we just downloaded and make it executable, and then execute it to create a configuration file. The same executable is used for all purposes in Velociraptor. There's a server and the client, and it's used for other commands. So here I am executing it and generating a config file. So there we go. That makes it executable. That generates a config file. So now if I do an ls-l, I will see that I have, let me make my window bigger. All right, I have the Velociraptor executable, and I have a config file here. This is a YAML file, which is pretty popular. YAML files are sort of like Python. Indentation matters. They're just a way to set a bunch of parameters. Now, if you look at that YAML file, it's got certificates that were randomly generated here, which we're going to use for an HTTPS server and for connections. And it also has server URLs, but the URL is localhost. And that's not going to do because we want this server to be an instant response server. We want it to pick up the Windows machine from somewhere else. So we have to give it a better address than that there. And so I can do this now on Azure. If it was my own local machine, I would replace all the addresses in there with the real address of this machine. But on Azure, you'll see if I do IP address, it only has the loopback address and it has a 10.1 address, which is not routable. So the real public address of this server is here in the Azure panel. Here, if I do, there it is. That's the real public address of the server. So it's a little complicated in Azure how to edit this file. And let me get back to my instructions. If it's on your own machine, you just make all the addresses equal to your public address of your server. But if it's in the cloud, it's a little more complicated. So let's edit this file. Okay, now the server is really important to change here because I want the client to be able to connect remotely. It'll come in on port 8000, so I change that to the actual public address. Here's the certificate. And here's the bind address, and the bind addresses, I want it to listen not on localhost, but on all local addresses. So zeros will do for that. So the services are listening on all interfaces. And there'll be some more junk down here. Private key. Okay, now the name of the host is now the public IP address. Okay, but the bind address is 0000, which is fine. And I think there should be a 5th address down here. Yeah, there's another bind address, and that should be 0000. So I think I've got it right. This is the trick on Azure. It's easy to get some of those addresses wrong. But if I've done that right, now it's got the right addresses, and I can move it to the /etc, again, for no terribly good reason, but that's typically where you put a configuration file for a server. And now I run the server. Now the first thing I'm going to do is create an administrator account. So I'll take the config that I just made, and then I'm going to add an admin user. So you can log in. So there it goes. I give it a password. Okay, now I can start the server. This is the command that will start the front-end server. It's just the name of the executable, the configuration file, and then front-end, and then I put a -v at the end to make it verbose so I can see what's going on. All right, there's the server running. It's starting. Now it's listening. The GUI is ready on this address ending in 8889. And the client is listening for clients to connect on the same address ending in 8000. So that tells me this is a cloud server. I need to open the cloud firewall to let through 8889 and 8000, or I'm not going to be able to use this. So I go to Azure, and I go to networking, which is a little confusing. I go home, and then virtual machines, and then Debian. 11A is the one I'm using. And now I'm trying to find it. I always have a little trouble finding it. Networking might be this one here. Yes, here's the firewall ports. Good. So I need to let through 8000 and 8889. So it's gotten much easier than it used to be. I just add inborn port rule, and all I do is give it 8000, and it will automatically choose good stuff for the rest of it, so I can just add. There it goes, she successfully created the rule. Now I add another one for 8889. And now I have to change the priority. They forgot to make this automatically increment. That's the only thing that you have to change. Now you can add that one. Okay, now we should be able to connect to that server from the outside. And we can test that. Let's just connect to that server here. Here's the IP address. I'd like to copy it, if it would let me. There we go. Copy. Okay, so if I go here and put in that address and then colon 8000, it's HTTPS. All right, I thought it would default to HTTPS, but it didn't. HTTPS. All right, and here we are. I'm in, so I have to proceed, even though it's unsafe. It's a self-signed certificate, and page not found. 404 page not found. Well, that's annoying. Let's see if the server, TLS handshake error, this TLS unknown certificate, yes. Well, GUI is ready, fronted, oh, that's client. The client is on 8000. The GUI is on 8889, that's why. 8889, okay. There we are. Now I log in with the administrator account I created earlier. There, now I'm in Velociraptor. So I can go home and I can see the CPU and memory installation and currently connected clients is 0. So I have a Velociraptor server, which acts like a domain controller. It can inspect and control the clients, but I don't have any clients yet. All right, let me check and see comments on Twitch. Can't find your key. No, we've been through that. All right, good. So now I want to connect my Windows client. And this is what's really quite difficult. It's very easy to fill up the addresses, but it does work. So I find, for some reason, on Azure, the private addresses cannot communicate, and I can't find any way to make them communicate, so the only way I know how to do it is with the public address. But I've already opened this machine, so it'll take client requests publicly, so I need to take my Windows machine and get it to connect. And the instructions to do that are here. Right, what's there? Adding a Windows client. So I'm going to edit the config file. Now, because I'm using Azure, I want to do this in a little more complicated way. I'm going to, I think I'll just stop the server for now. Now, to make another window, that's usually how you want to do it. All right, so it's SSH sambound at that IP address, which should be up there. It is 20.168. Let me zoom in. Okay, 20.168, 11.2.11. Okay, there we go, and a password. All right, now I'm in. Now I'm going to go into the Velociraptor directory. Okay, now, all right, I wanted to modify the config.yaml, but what I'm going to do is copy it, because the client config is different than the server config now. So let me see if I can get this junk out of the way so I can see what I'm doing. All right, so I'm going to do sudo copy etch Velociraptor config to etch Velociraptor client config.yaml. and then I'm going to nano that one. All right, and the main thing I have to do is below the nonce line, I need to add this, because the client needs to know that it's not a real HTTPS certificate. And so this is how you tell it to accept this line, even though it's not, even though it's self-signed, and you indent it correctly. Whoops, not letting indenting for some reason. There we go. So indent it. Now, the other thing I need to make sure is that the address here, this is the right server address, so it might be all right. It has to have the right address for this real public address for the server, or the Windows client will not be able to find the server. So there's the client configuration. Now, I'm going to create a Windows client installer. And this is how you do it. You run the Velociraptor, you take the config from that client config I just made. So I'll have to, what's that?
Missing a dot.
What's that?
Missing a dot.
Missing a dot. Okay, thank you. Good. All right. Good. And then I'm going to create a client config called clientconfig.yaml. And it's a much simpler thing. So I'm going to do this, but I want to use the other configuration file, the one I just made. I guess I could have used the same file. I was a little nervous about it. Okay, that'll create a thing called clientconfig.yaml. So here's the client config, and I can just less that. See how it looks. And you see it has the public address of the server, and then the client certificate, and that's really pretty much it. It only has one address, and it's a good address, so this should work. Now I'm going to create a Windows executable. So first I have to download the generic Windows executable from the server, which is here. All right, and now I'm going to stick that client in this to make a single run executable. I could put a client file on the Windows machine and use it there, but this is usually what you want. You want to make a single file executable that includes the client. This is what malware authors do. The viruses you get infected by, the bots, have the address of the command and control server in them. Of course, because there, exe. All right, so this is going to take the Velociraptor executable, and it's going to do config repack exe to take the Velociraptor Windows executable and compile the information from the client config into it and create a thing called repackaged velociraptor.exe. And I'm going to call this 7 because I made a bunch of ones earlier. I don't want to get them confused. Now, so I've now got a file, which is the executable to connect to this server, and it is called repackaged Velociraptor 7. Now I have to get that to the Windows machine somehow. In my project, you do it with WinSCP, but that I had trouble making that work with Azure. So what I'm going to do here, it's possible, I guess, to get it working with Azure, but anyway, because I wasn't using a password at the time, I had a problem. Now I'm using a password, it'll work. So this is a good answer. I'll just do that. Okay, so I go to my Windows machine, and all I'm going to need is the IP address of the Linux machine. So let me make sure I've got that copied somewhere. It should be here. Okay, there it is. So I copy that address. Now I go to my Windows machine, which is here. Okay. And I already installed WinSCP on here, but I couldn't use it very well because the logging of the certificate was too annoying. But now I can do it. So there's WinSCP, an app. All right. And by the way, you could just use SCP from the PowerShell command line too these days. You don't really need this app. But anyway, it'll work. So I put in that IP address and the username and the password I chose before. Okay, and now I log in. And I agree to log in. And look, there we are. There's my Linux machine, the Velociraptor folder. So I can go in there. Here's the repackaged file. Here I am in my documents folder. That'll be fine. So I'll just drag this and drop it in my documents folder. And there it goes. All right. Well, that was pretty good. So let's get rid of this. I don't need it anymore. Now, I could install the service right away, but I found it to be better to do it in 2 steps so I can see if it's working. Here's the Velociraptor server running. on my Linux machine. Now I'm going to check the opening ports with sudo ss-pant. Let's show me the TCP listening ports, and you'll see it is listening on 8889 for the GUI, and it's listening on 8000 for connections from the client. There's also a couple weird things in 8001 and 8003. I don't know what they are. They're always there. I think they're for performance monitoring or something. But the one I care about is 8000. It's listening on port 8000. That's what we want. So now I'm going to run that stuff on the Windows server. So I need to get to here we are. Okay, so I need to run a terminal as administrator, which is, there we are, run as administrator. This is Windows 11, they call it terminal. It'll work, it's PowerShell, doesn't matter what it is. Now I need to go to download, documents is where I put it. Okay, and now do a directory, and there it is. So I'm going to run that file, and to get it feedback on the server, I ran server -v. On the client, I'm going to run client -v. So it won't automatically run when you restart the machine, but it will give me all this information while it's running so I can see if it's working. And so there it is, sending information to the server, trying to connect, and it looks like it was received. So this looks good. Let's see what it looks like on the server. On the server, I've received a post from the client. This looks very good, and the acid test to see if it's working is to look at it in the browser. So here's the Velociraptor server. So you click this and go to Show All Clients, and I have a client. This is what took me like hours to get working earlier, because if you make any mistake with the addresses in that file, it can give you grief. But there it is. It's connected to the client. The Windows 11 client is connecting to the server. So this is the important part of this project. And now, let's use the virtual file system. This is the only time we're going to do this. So now I have this Linux server has the ability to control that Windows machine. You click on it, and now you can do various things. One thing you can do is go to the virtual file system, and now you have NTFS and registry, and I don't know what the auto is. If you click on NTFS, it'll show you the hard drives, but by default, you choose something, and there's no data until you get it with the refresh button. This button will refresh the current directory. This will do a recursive refresh all the way down, which would be thousands of files and take forever, so I don't want to do that. This will give me the top level. And the top level, of course, is just C and D. And sometimes they show up here, but if they don't, it's just a problem with your browser, and all you have to do is refresh your browser. There, and now you can see C and D. So I could dig through the file system and find files here. I could go to C and see it's there. And you see here's the configuration files with dollars that are used by the system. And if I make it show, say, 10 at a time, then I'll see more of them down here. And later on, I'll see things like, if I go to the next page, I'll see things like programs and settings and documents and program files, documents and settings, and all the usual stuff. So I could dig through the box in this manner and find files and folders if I wanted to. And similarly, I could go through the registry. You just click on registry, refresh it, and you'll see the top level of the registry, which should be the 5 root hives. There we are, HKey classes root, and local machine and all that jazz. And it's not showing up here, but it will if you refresh the page. There they are. So I could now go into like HKey local machine and refresh it. And now I'll see the subkeys under there. There they are, hardware, SAM, software, and security. And again, if you refresh it, they'll appear on the left. So that's the joy of the virtual file system. You can browse through the system remotely, which is something you might do, but it's usually a very inefficient way to do instant response, and I'm never going to do this again. But the ability is there. So let me stop this recording.